long before maps had edges or names. The wanderers crossed a plain where the air carried a faint taste of iron and wood smoke, as though the earth itself had been exhaling slowly for centuries beneath a sky turning from ash to gold. They walked with the patience of people who had forgotten urgency, moving across soil cracked by 100 summers, yet still soft in places where roots clung stubbornly to the memory of rain, their footprints dissolving into wind-sculpted patterns that shifted before they could look back. Above them, the first stars began to wake, faint as whispers pressed against glass, their light barely cutting through the fading bruise of dusk, and though no one yet spoke of it, the wanderers felt the air change as though the night were clearing its throat to sing. In the distance, low hills gathered like sleeping animals, their flanks dark against the last strands of daylight, while the sky deepened into a blue so rich it seemed to drink sound from the world, until only the soft tread of the wanderers' steps remained. A wind came down from the north, carrying the resinous scent of pine and the cooler breath of places untouched by fire, threading through the grass so that it leaned in long silver waves before lifting again as if reluctant to leave the earth entirely. The wanderers moved without torches, trusting the rising light of stars to brush the path with enough clarity, though often the trail vanished among stones, bleached pale as old bone, and they walked more by instinct than sight, guided by something older than direction. Now and then they paused beside pools left from vanished rains, the water holding the last warmth of day against its skin, while beneath the surface, minnows flickered like thoughts too quick to follow, their movements breaking the reflected stars into trembling fragments of light. Somewhere far off, a heron lifted from the reeds, its wings carrying the slow dignity of evening itself, each beat scattering faint echoes across the marsh before it drifted toward a horizon too wide for the wanderers to measure or name. They came to a stand of poplars where the trunks rose pale and straight as pillars, holding up nothing but the night, their leaves chattering softly like teeth against the chill wind. And here they rested among the roots, while the first fire was coaxed to life. The firelight revealed faces, weathered by distance rather than age, eyes reflecting not only the flames, but the small, silvery wounds of stars overhead, as though the sky itself had been pricked open to let through its language one syllable at a time. They cooked nothing, for there was little to cook, but held out hands to the warmth as though gathering memories from the coals, the air smelling faintly of smoke and pine sap, the sparks rising like insects toward constellations no one yet had named. One of them, the youngest, traced shapes in the dirt with a charred stick, lines crossing and curling until they resembled nothing familiar. Yet the others watched in silence, as though some part of them recognized the motion, even if not the meaning. It was said among them, though never too loudly, that the stars had once spoken in patterns of light and distance, a language older than the ground beneath their feet, but now only pieces remained, scattered and faint, like echoes of a song almost forgotten. The night grew colder, pressing the firelight inward, until the world beyond became only rustling grass, the occasional cry of something hunting in the dark, and the slow wheeling of constellations whose edges seemed to sharpen as the air cleared toward midnight. They lay wrapped in cloaks, smelling of wool and travel, the ground uneven but familiar beneath them, and listened to the long breaths of wind folding over the hills, as though the earth itself were asleep and dreaming through the cool hours before dawn. Somewhere among the deeper shadows, a fox barked once, sharp against the vastness. Then silence returned heavier than before, the fire snapping softly, as though unwilling to wake the others whose eyes had closed, but whose minds wandered still beneath the stars. Dreams came like water soaking through cloth, carrying images not wholly their own. Rivers under moonlight, mountains shaped like broken teeth, voices speaking in cadences that trembled like heat over stone, yet left no trace upon waking except a quiet ache behind the eyes. One of the wanderers woke before the others, stirred by some rhythm beyond the reach of sleep, and watched the coals sinking into themselves until only a faint red pulse remained. The sky above crowded now with stars so bright they seemed carved from ice. He thought he saw among them patterns too deliberate to be accident, lines connecting in slow revelations until shapes emerged stag. A river, a flame cupped in two hands, yet even as he traced them the wind shifted and the patterns blurred like breath on glass. When the others woke, the morning smelled of ash and dew, the fire a memory among blackened stones, and the sun climbing pale and expressionless over the eastern hills, as though nothing at all had been spoken by the stars during the long, cold night. They rose stiffly, shaking frost from their cloaks, their footprints crisp in the half-frozen grass, and began walking again without words. The youngest carrying the charred stick, still, as though the earth might need more of those strange markings before the journey ended. The land sloped downward into valleys lined with birch, whose white trunks gleamed like bone under the growing light, the air warming enough to carry the faint sweetness of thawing soil and the musk of animals that had passed unseen through the darkness. At a stream they drank from cupped hands, the water tasting of stone and roots, cold enough to tighten the skin across their faces. And for a moment they lingered there, watching sunlight scatter across the ripples like fragments of some forgotten alphabet. One found a shard of obsidian among the pebbles, its surface glinting with a darkness that held the entire morning inside it, and turned it over in his hand, as though it too might bear some trace of the stars' elusive language pressed into its sheen. The plain stretched ahead, rising toward hills blurred with distance, and the sky unfolded wider than before, streaked with the pale remains of night where stars still burned faintly, as if reluctant to surrender their meanings to the bright and speechless day. By noon the wind carried the smell of rain from somewhere far beyond the hills, a promise they would follow, though none could say why, except that such promises had always led them onward through landscapes empty, yet never entirely without presence. They walked until the sun lowered again, heavy and red as cooling metal, the shadows stretching long across the grass, while birds arrowed toward their roosts, their wings black against the dying light as though stitching the horizon closed for night. When they camped the second evening, the stars appeared earlier, sharper, as if aware of being watched, and the youngest again drew lines in the dirt, slower this time, more certain, while the others leaned close, though none spoke of what they hoped to see emerge. The wind rose after midnight, carrying dry leaves across the ground in hissing circles, lifting sparks from the fire into brief constellations of their own before they vanished. And above it all, the true stars glimmered with patient indifference, older than any kingdom yet to be dreamed. The wanderers slept once more beneath them, their breathing shallow against the deep silence. And though the stars offered no clear answers, something in their cold brightness seemed to listen, as though the language still existed, waiting only for someone to remember how to speak it. At dawn the wanderers descended through meadows silvered with dew, where the grass leaned under the weight of water like weary dancers bowing to the first faint light spilling across the edges of a pale and untroubled sky. The air carried a sweetness sharpened by distance, the scent of pine and thawing earth braided with the thin metallic temps that often followed storms long vanished, as though the land kept their memories buried deep beneath roots and stones. Far ahead, the river moved with a restlessness the hills could not contain, its surface folding upon itself in slow, unbroken gestures. The water dark as smoked glass, where shadows from overhanging willows brushed the current like paint dragged across canvas. The wanderers reached its bank, where the mud held the impression of deer hooves beside the delicate script of birds whose names no one spoke, each track soft-edged as though written by wind rather than the passing of living things. They crouched to drink, cupping the water in their hands, feeling its cold clarity rush through their fingers before lifting it to lips. Cracked by the dry breath of high plains, where rain seldom stayed long enough to taste, the current carried with it fragments of the forest upstream, slivers of bark, seed husks, a feather drifting like a thought half-formed, and, beneath it all, a music not shaped by any throat, but by stone and distance and unhurried time. Some said the river had never once slept, flowing through centuries, as others dreamt and woke and built their small fires upon its banks, its voice changing only with the season, yet always speaking in the same low language of water and gravity. The wanderers followed its curve westward, where the sun now lifted in quiet ceremony above cliffs veined with quartz, the rock faces igniting in pale orange, as though light itself were drawn toward every hidden mirror in the stone. Wind traveled beside them, lifting the edges of their cloaks and rattling the dry seed heads of last summer's grasses until the air was filled with a brittle applause that faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the river's unbroken murmur. Along the bank, dragonflies stitched the warm air with translucent wings, their bodies gleaming copper and green before vanishing above eddies where the water swirled as if considering some shape it could never quite hold before releasing it again downstream. The path grew narrow where the hills pressed close, roots snaking from the soil like ribs exposed by hunger, and the wanderers moved single file beneath branches, heavy with lichen, soft as uncombed wool, brushing against their shoulders and hair. At midday they rested upon a spit of sand, where the river widened and slowed, its surface bright enough to hurt the eyes, the shallows alive with minnows glinting like coins scattered by careless hands beneath the translucent weight of water. The youngest among them knelt tracing lines through the wet sand, circles intersecting like ripples folding over each other, and the others watched without speaking, the shapes resembling neither map nor word, yet carrying the patience of someone listening inwardly for instructions. A heron stalked the shallows nearby, each step placed with ceremonial slowness until it struck, the fish vanishing in a single fluid motion of beak and neck, and then the bird stood motionless again as though nothing at all had happened. Clouds drifted low from the west, smelling faintly of rain but breaking apart above the river before the first drops could fall, their shadows sliding across the water so that for a moment the current looked carved from darker stone. When they began walking again, the wind had cooled, carrying the resinous fragrance of cedar mixed with the musk of damp earth where the river undercut its banks, roots dangling like the hair of giants leaning to drink unseen at night. The sound of the water grew louder where the channel narrowed between rocks, a trembling urgency that sent foam swirling against the stones, before smoothing itself downstream as though embarrassed by the sudden outburst of noise and speed. They crossed where boulders rose, like sleeping cattle, the river slipping around them in two divided tongues before rejoining. Below, with a sigh audible even above the wind, threading through cracks in the canyon walls, stained black by ages of rain. On the far side, the land opened again into meadows ringed by spruce, whose needles whispered under the same wind that now tugged at the wanderers. Sleeves and scattered last year's leaves in dry spirals across the stony ground. Here, the river bent southward in a gesture so gradual it seemed almost unwilling, as though testing the loyalty of its own banks before committing to the turn that would carry it beyond the reach of the wanderers. Slow, unhurried steps. They camped that evening where the current divided around an island grown thick with alder and willow, the water speaking in two voices that met again downstream with the gentleness of companions, reunited after walking different roads toward the same horizon. The fire they built crackled beneath, wood still green at the core, sending smoke upward in pale twisting ribbons that drifted through branches toward the first bright stars gathering above the dark rim of the western hills. Across the water night insects began their thin metallic songs, each note brief yet persistent until the air itself seemed stitched with sound. A fabric woven from countless tiny lives, carrying on regardless of the firelight or the tired travelers beside it. They ate little, sharing what remained of the dried fruit and roots carried from the plains, the taste sharp with stored sunlight, and drank again from the river whose coldness had not lessened even under the weight of so many miles. One by one they lay down upon cloaks spread across the sand, where the day's warmth still lingered faintly beneath the cooling breath of evening. Eyes drawn upward to stars, brightening through the thinning smoke, as though curious about the sleepers below. Dreams came again, though no one spoke of them upon waking, fragments clinging like cobwebs at the edges of thought shapes moving through water, too deep to reach, voices echoing across valleys where no one had stood for generations of wind and rain. Before dawn, the youngest rose quietly, feet leaving shallow prints in the sand as he went to the water's edge, where mist drifted above the current like breath rising from something enormous sleeping beneath the surface. He watched the river carry its burden of leaves and small branches toward distances none of them would see, the sound filling the silence between stars fading overhead and birds not yet ready to begin their quarrelsome songs among the trees. When the others woke, the sky was already whitening above the hills. The fire, a cold scatter of ash, trampled by their own boots as they packed what little they owned into bundles smelling of smoke and damp wool. The river went on speaking beside them as they left, its voice neither louder nor softer for their presence, carrying fragments of forest and mountain toward seas that waited beyond imagining, its current sleepless, unbroken, unwilling ever to be still. And though the wanderers would follow it only so far before turning toward lands unmarked by water, they would remember its language, the way it folded night and wind and distance into one endless sentence none of them could translate, yet none could forget. Beyond the river, the land flattened into distances so wide they seemed to press the sky downward. The air dry enough that every breath carried a faint taste of stone and sunlight baked into the earth for uncounted summers. The wanderers moved slowly across this openness where nothing broke the horizon except the shimmer of heat rising from crusted ground, each step leaving a powdery ghost that the wind quickly erased as though unwilling to keep any record of their passing. Underfoot the soil grew pale and brittle until it gleamed like bones, salt crystals gathering in shallow hollows, where some ancient sea had withdrawn long before memory, leaving behind its silence stitched into the cracked geometry of the flats. The sun climbed with deliberate weight, pouring its white gaze across miles without shadow, so that the air itself seemed to waver, the light scattering until edges blurred, and even the wanderers' own shapes trailed them in uncertain silhouettes. Sweat dried before it could gather on their skin, the wind carrying a thin, rasping sound across the flats, as though the earth itself were whispering through its teeth, the voice of a place where water had long since abandoned its post. By midday the sky paled into a brightness without warmth, the kind that held no kindness for eyes searching the horizon. And the wanderers wrapped cloth across their faces, so only their gazes remained uncovered beneath the press of light. They walked toward a line where the flats met the first scattered outcrops of stone, dark humps rising like islands from a sea that had forgotten how to move, the heat rippling above them like breath against glass. When they reached the stones, they rested in the narrow shadows, leaning eastward, the rock surfaces rough and warm beneath their palms, smelling faintly of minerals baked into a language older than rain and carved by wind into unreadable scripts. Here they drank the last of the water carried from the river, the skins nearly empty, but enough to wet their throats before they lay back against the stone, the salt glare pressing at their eyelids even through closed eyes. Sleep came briefly, thin and restless, the air vibrating with heat so that dreams arrived like mirages, glimpses of trees heavy with shade, the low hum of bees over dark soil, the sound of water where no water moved. By late afternoon the wind shifted, carrying with it the cool promise of night, though the sun still burned white along the horizon, its descent slow enough to feel deliberate, as though reluctant to release its hold on the empty land. The wanderers rose again, leaving the rocks behind as the sky deepened toward copper and rose, long shadows gathering across the flats until the ground seemed covered in dark water pooling outward from every step they took. As the first stars pierced through the fading light, a wind swept across the flats, strong enough to lift dust into low spirals, their edges glowing faintly in the last sunlight, like smoke rising from fires too distant to be seen. They stopped when the sun's rim finally slid beneath the farthest edge of land, the air cooling with a suddenness that carried relief through their bones, the salt crust beneath them radiating back the day's warmth like fading coals. One by one, the stars thickened overhead until the entire sky appeared fretted with silver, constellations bright enough to cast pale shadows, their patterns trembling slightly in the heat still leaking upward from the earth. The wanderers built no fire, for there was nothing here to burn, but sat instead upon the salt crust watching the meteors begin, each streak of light scratching the night open before vanishing behind distances too great to follow. Some fell silently, while others left brief glowing trails that curved before fading, as though written by a hand uncertain how to form the letters of some immense forgotten script across the black parchment of the sky. The youngest among them lay flat upon the salt, its roughness cold through the thin cloth beneath his shoulders, eyes wide as though afraid to blink lest the language vanish before he could learn even a single word of it. All around them the meteors came in intervals too regular for accident, each arrival burning across the darkness like the stroke of a match, so that for a moment the whole sky seemed to breathe fire before returning again to stillness. The air carried the faint smell of dust stirred by their own movements, mingled with the sharper tang of salt, while above them the night unraveled in streaks of pale gold and white, each one falling without sound toward horizons unseen. Some of the wanderers began tracing shapes upon the ground with fingertips crusted white, connecting invisible points across the flats as though hoping the language overhead might answer through some reflection carved upon the earth itself. The meteors continued, countless and tireless, until the stars themselves appeared to shift in sympathy, entire constellations seeming to lean closer, the way listeners sometimes bend toward a voice too soft to hear clearly. They did not speak, for words felt small beside such distances, and even their thoughts slowed until only the sky moved, the falling embers crossing its vastness with the calm certainty of something repeating instructions older than wind or fire. When at last the meteors faded and the stars steadied again into their patient positions, the wanderers lay upon the salt crust, watching breath cloud faintly above their faces. As the air cooled toward the edge of frost, one of them murmured in his sleep, though no one caught the words, the sound carrying only a tone of reverence, like someone reciting from memory a prayer whose meaning had long ago been lost, yet whose cadence still soothed the heart. They woke before dawn, shivering beneath cloaks stiffened by cold, the salt glimmering pale blue around them where moonlight pooled in shallow hollows, the sky paling above the eastern horizon like smoke thinning after a long quiet fire. As they prepared to leave, the youngest paused once more to look back across the flats, where their footprints trailed into distance until wind erased them, the salt stretching white and silent toward horizons where no embers now fell. The rising sun burned color into the sky too quickly for comfort, scattering the last shadows before the wanderers moved on. Its light spreading across the flats like water poured slowly until nothing remained of night except memory. And though the day reclaimed the land with its heat and glare, each traveler carried the silent conviction that some message had passed through the sky while they watched, written in fire along paths no kingdom would ever chart or name. They left the flats behind as the sun climbed, walking toward the faint blue humps of mountains waiting at the edge of vision, the salt wind at their backs and the memory of falling embers stitched quietly into the rhythm of their steps. The mountains rose slowly from the horizon, like memories returning after long absence, their ridges fading through layers of haze until the farthest peaks seemed carved from distance, itself rather than stone or earth, touched by wind and time. The wanderers approached beneath a sun pale from its climb across air thinned by height, the slopes spreading outward in folds of shale and moss where springs traced bright threads through grass already leaning under the weight of its own green silence. Everywhere the smell of water followed them, sharper now, with the nearness of snowfields hidden among higher cliffs, each gust of wind carrying the cool breath of heights too far yet for footsteps to claim, but close enough for lungs to taste. They found fossils in the lower rocks, shells pressed into limestone like coins hammered into the walls of forgotten shrines. their spirals perfect though bleached by ages, proof of seas once resting here long before rivers cut these valleys toward distant coasts. The youngest wandered among them, running fingertips along the grooves, as though expecting to feel warmth still lingering from tides that had fled before memory. Each curve speaking in the hush of things whose voices never entirely leave the places they abandon. The air thinned as they climbed through heather, bruised purple by wind. Bees weaving slowly between flowers crouched low against stone, as if unwilling to trust stems too easily broken by weather that could turn without warning among these heights. By midday they reached a ledge where the valley opened below in a vast green hush, sunlight sliding through clouds in pale columns like cathedral walls built only of air. The river far beneath, glimmering silver as a thread dropped by careless hands. They rested, there sharing the last of the roots carried from the flats, their taste earthy and bitter against tongues cracked by altitude, the cold wind combing through their hair until even silence felt woven into its long, unbroken fingers. Above them, peaks leaned white against a sky clearing toward deeper blue, the highest ridges etched with glaciers that clung like stubborn thoughts, refusing to leave, no matter how many summers tried to warm their memory from the stone. Toward evening, the air cooled quickly, so that each breath rose visible before faces darkened by travel, the light softening across slopes, veined with snowmelt, until rocks glowed faintly as though lit from within by fires left burning centuries below the surface. They built their own small fire in a hollow shielded from the wind by boulders crusted with lichen, its flames thin but steady beneath the brittle twigs gathered from stunted pines, clinging to cracks where soil existed only by accident. Smoke drifted upward, curling around stones before losing itself among stars brightening one by one overhead. The first sharp enough to cast pinprick reflections across the surface of their water. Flasks lying empty beside cloaks spread against the cold ground. That night the sky felt close enough to touch, each constellation sharp as frost rhyming the dark, their shapes bending slowly above the peaks as though watching the wanderers sleep curled against one another for warmth beside the dwindling fire. Dreams came again, carrying images none could explain, shores glimmering beneath moons too large for this world, forests swaying without wind, voices speaking through storms, whose lightning wrote brief alphabets across mountains, breaking open to reveal light rather than stone. Before dawn, one woke shivering beneath a sky paling toward silver, frost whitening the heather where their breaths had melted small hollows during the night. The silence so deep it felt carved into the air rather than merely filling it. He walked to the ledge again, where darkness still drowned the valley, but the highest ridges already blushed faintly beneath sunlight, too far to warm anything yet except the thin banners of cloud unraveling across the eastern horizon. When the others rose, they followed narrow trails upward, where the ground crunched beneath boots, stiff with frozen mud, the wind sharper, now carrying the cry of hawks circling above cliffs whose faces split into shadows, too steep for snow to cling. By midday they stood among boulders streaked with ice melt, the air bright with the smell of granite warmed by sun, listening to water drip steadily from ledges where it vanished into cracks with the patience of centuries slowly carving new valleys. Here they found a stone shaped like a bowl by wind and rain, its surface polished smooth as river pebbles, though it sat far above any stream, and in its snowmelt gathered reflecting a single burning point of sunlight. The youngest stared into it, tracing the rim with fingertips numb from cold, as though expecting the water to tremble into words. Some fragment of language left behind by glaciers, speaking slowly through thaw rather than through human breath or memory. They lingered there while the wind combed long grasses, trembling between stones, the air flickering with the silver wings of insects climbing from cracks to drift briefly before vanishing again into folds of rock older than any forest or plain below. As evening fell, the mountains turned copper, then violet under a sky clearing toward crystal, each ridge sharp enough to feel cut from glass, the snowfields glowing faintly until stars crowded above them, brighter than on any night before. They made camp among boulders where the wind dropped suddenly, as though respecting their small circle of firelight, the flames casting their faces upward toward peaks standing black against constellations, scattered like seeds across soil only the sky could till. No one spoke while eating the thin meal of roots and dried berries, the fire snapping softly under branches carried since morning, each spark floating upward to vanish among stars whose own embers waited unmoved by such small imitations below. Later they lay awake beneath cloaks stiffening with frost, watching meteors drag pale threads briefly across the dark, each one so silent it might have been imagined, except for the faint afterimage fading slowly from the corners of tired eyes. They felt the mountains listening in their stillness, the glaciers holding breath above valleys where rivers began as snowmelt, dripping without hurry toward forests too far to see, yet waiting patiently as though promised centuries before the first leaf ever opened. When morning came, the wind carried the smell of distance again, sharper than pine or snow, like stone itself exhaling after night, and the wanderers gathered their bundles moving westward where peaks leaned lower, toward lands breathing with softer weather. Before leaving, the youngest looked back once toward the highest ridges veined with blue ice under sunlight flashing along edges too bright for eyes to hold, as though the mountains kept mirrors turned toward skies no one yet could read. And though they left without answers, the wanderers carried that image like a sentence half heard in a dream, certain the peaks had spoken somehow through wind and glacier, a language older than rivers carving patient letters far below among the valleys. Westward the land leaned downward slowly, the peaks softening into foothills where pines gathered in dark clusters along streams winding through meadows, brittle with frost even while sunlight fell across them in wide, unbroken silence, carrying the weight of long distances. The wanderers followed the valley floor where water glimmered between reeds, stiff as carved bone, its surface broken only by the shadows of birds, lifting themselves into the pale air before vanishing toward ridges fading blue behind the lowering sun. Here the wind smelled of resin rising from needles carpeting the forest floor, their fragrance caught in pockets of stillness, where shafts of light slipped through branches, silvered by frost that melted slowly into soil black with centuries of fallen leaves. By evening they reached the lake, its surface already hardening beneath the cold, the ice clouded by bubbles and fragments of reeds trapped like small histories written into glass, the edges lined by stones shaped smooth through ages of patient water. They built their fire beside the largest of these stones, its warmth sliding outward across ice that shone faintly under the first stars. the flames bright enough to reflect in ripples where the freezing water had not yet stilled completely into silence. The youngest wandered near the shore, running gloved fingers across the ice smooth as polished metal, listening to the hollow song rising faintly whenever the surface shifted against itself. A music deep and slow, as though the lake dreamed in winter sleep. Overhead, the stars multiplied quickly, their light unbroken by cloud or wind. So bright the frozen water caught them in broken patterns, shimmering across its skin until the whole lake seemed to burn with constellations held closer than the sky above. The wanderers stood there, watching meteors fall in long arcs, whose reflections followed through the ice, as though the earth itself mirrored the heavens, each streak folding quietly into darkness, leaving both sky and water unchanged except for the memory of light. Later, they laid branches across the fire until its smoke drifted blue into the cold, the smell of resin mingling with the sweetness of sap crackling along the wood. The air so still, the flames moved only in slow, deliberate shapes. Beyond the circle of warmth, the lake stretched white and silver beneath stars bright enough to glint along the edges of reeds frozen mid-bend, each stalk holding the moonlight as though refusing to release it back toward the sky above. The oldest among them walked out carefully across the ice, listening to the groan rising beneath his boots, a sound deep enough to carry through water and stone below. The lake answering softly, as though speaking in voices older than wind. He paused near the center, where the frozen surface held both moon and stars, so perfectly that standing there felt like balancing between two skies. The world above, mirrored by the world beneath, locked together through winter's patient breath. When he returned, his face carried the stillness found only in places where distance folds inward upon itself, where echoes gather without vanishing. And he sat long beside the fire without speaking, while frost traced his cloak into pale, stiff edges. The night settled slowly over the lake until the wind fell away completely. So silent, the crack of ice expanding along distant edges sounded like words carried across frozen pages none of them yet knew how to read. Each drift of snow, tumbling lightly from the pines along the shore, seemed careful not to break the quiet, its touch soft enough to disappear upon the firelit ground, without leaving sound or mark beyond the faint darkening of ash. Dreams came again, this time filled with images of lanterns drifting across water, unfrozen beneath warmer moons. Lights carried by unseen hands, moving slowly between shore and horizon until the night itself seemed to breathe through their unbroken procession. The youngest woke briefly before dawn to find the sky pale as unpolished silver. The fire collapsed inward upon coals glowing like the last embers of some older sun. The air so cold it stung even through the thick weave of wool. He crossed the frozen surface where starlight still clung faintly, crouching near cracks where water murmured below as though speaking in a tongue too deep for breath, each word rising slow as bubbles caught and silenced by ice unbroken above. When the others rose, the light had softened across the valley, the trees rimmed with frost, shining as though cast from glass, each branch bending beneath crystal leaves shaped only by wind and silence through the longest hours of the night. They broke camp without hurry, carrying the last warmth of the fire inside cloaks smelling faintly of smoke, the air sharpening against faces flushed by the cold, while the path westward curved along the lake where shadows moved beneath the ice. Sometimes shapes passed slowly under the frozen surface, where currents flowed between reeds locked stiff above water, too dark for eyes to follow. Their movement sending faint ripples through reflections of clouds sliding pale across the widening morning sky. By midday the wind returned, carrying the smell of thaw where sunlight fell stronger against slopes beyond the lake. Its warmth gathering slowly along branches where frost loosened before falling silently into drifts, shrinking back toward the shadows of stones. They paused on a ridge, looking back once toward the frozen water shining beneath the sun, as though it held stars even through daylight. The surface scattering light until the lake seemed woven entirely from the memory of last night's constellations. The valley opened before them beyond the pines, hills rolling outward toward plains blurred by distance where rivers glimmered faintly between lines of trees black against snow, already softening under the first true warmth since they had left the highest peaks. Before evening they reached a stream running clear between banks thawed into mud smelling of roots and damp leaves, its water carrying pieces of ice spinning slowly beneath overhanging branches where the first small buds had begun to swell unseen. They followed it until the forest thinned into open ground, where wind moved easily again across grass pressed flat by melting snow. The sky above them bright now, with clouds stretched thin as gauze unraveling westward toward the edge of sight. When night came, they made no fire, choosing instead to sleep beneath stars burning sharp through air already colder again, their breath rising pale into branches, whispering faintly, as though the forest itself spoke low among roots drinking slowly from thawing soil. Somewhere far behind the frozen lake shifted under moonlight, whose reflection still lived across its surface, the sound carrying faintly through the dark like words, begun long before voices or kingdoms, yet lasting among wind and water without needing to end. The hills folded slowly toward a hollow where the land gathered its winds into stillness, a place where birds did not circle and trees leaned inward as though listening to something buried beneath the earth's patient breathing. The wanderers stepped carefully along the slopes, their boots sinking into soil softened by meltwater, carrying the scent of moss and cold stone. The air, heavy with silence, broken only by the faint creak of branches shifting against each other high above. Here sunlight fell differently, pale and slow, as though crossing some unseen boundary, its warmth barely touching the ground where roots sprawled across rocks, wearing fur of emerald moss, so thick it glimmered when drops of thaw slid silently downward. The youngest paused beside a fallen trunk where bark had peeled away, revealing rings darkened by centuries. The wood cold beneath gloved fingers, yet holding the faint smell of resin trapped deep where no wind had carried it away. At the valley's center stood a clearing rimmed with trees older than the others, their trunks hollow yet unbroken, branches weaving overhead into a ceiling through which sunlight reached the ground only in narrow, trembling threads of dust-bright gold. Beneath this dim cathedral of roots and windless air, the ground bore no shadow, each branch and stone casting only the faintest blur that lingered even when clouds crossed above, as though light here refused to move at ordinary speed. The wanderers rested near a pool, fed by water sliding from cliffs hidden among vines, its surface untroubled by wind so that it held the trees in perfect reflection until a leaf fell slowly and sent circles outward in widening silence. One of them knelt to drink, cupping water clear enough to show the pale sky through his hands. The taste carrying cold deeper than snow, yet also something faintly sweet, like fruit once ripened beneath suns warmer than any they knew. The oldest walked beyond the clearing, following deer trails, stitched lightly through undergrowth, pale with new leaves. The air damp and still, as though the forest held its breath, waiting for footsteps to fade, before resuming whatever silence it had kept. He found stones, shaped into a ring half buried among ferns, each rock blackened by fire, long cooled, their edges softened by centuries of rain, so that they seemed less built than grown slowly from the ground itself, like patient roots. Returning, he said nothing, but sat upon a fallen trunk, watching dust drift lazily where light angled through the branches, his eyes carrying the same stillness that settled across the valley as evening crept down the surrounding slopes toward them. They cooked quietly beside the pool, firelight trembling along the water where stars had begun appearing one by one overhead, each reflection remaining unbroken as though time itself slowed inside the clearing, each ripple taking longer to vanish than it should. The youngest lay awake long after the others slept, the night warm enough here that no wind moved through the trees, the branches above black against a sky where constellations drifted slowly yet never seemed to leave the same positions. Somewhere near the cliffs, an owl called once before, falling silent again, its wings carrying no sound when it passed low over the clearing, its shadow sliding across the ground so faintly it seemed to belong to some older night. Toward dawn, mist gathered between the trees, carrying the smell of wet leaves and distant stone, wrapping trunks until they seemed to rise endlessly upward from a sea of white through which the first sunlight spilled in slow, golden fragments. The wanderers rose among this pale, drifting light, their breaths soft against air neither warm nor cold, the clearing still holding its shadows, thin and fixed, even as day returned, the sky widening above the slopes, edging the valley. They left slowly, following the stream westward, where it slipped from the clearing beneath roots, dangling like curtains. The water dark at first, then brightening where sunlight struck it again beyond the last, leaning trees guarding the valley's quiet boundary. Behind them, the clearing lay unchanged, as though no fire had burned and no voices stirred its stillness. Its pool already smooth again, beneath branches where shadows clung lightly as breath upon glass, never warming nor fading despite the rising sun. By afternoon, the forest thinned into grasslands, stirred faintly by wind-carrying scents of heather and sun-warmed stone, the sky opening wide above hills where clouds moved again. After so long drifting motionless beyond the valley's patient silence, they paused upon a ridge where air smelled of rain not yet fallen, the earth stretching outward in long folds, toward horizons pale with distance, each line of hills softening into blue until sky and ground blurred like water meeting itself. Here the wind returned in long, unbroken currents, carrying warmth across slopes where flowers bent beneath it, scattering faint pollen, glimmering briefly before vanishing, the air filled with the quiet hum of bees weaving low among the grasses. That night they camped beside a river, flowing broad and slow between banks lined with willows, its surface carrying moonlight in restless patterns, breaking softly against roots where frogs called among reeds, swaying beneath stars, bright again after so much cloud. The wanderers slept, hearing water moving endlessly under constellations wheeling westward above them. the valley behind, holding its shadows unchanged. Its pool reflecting the same stillness beneath branches where no wind moved and no bird sang for longer than a moment. Beyond the last grasslands, where flowers bent beneath the evening wind, the earth slowly surrendered its green to dust, until the wanderers found themselves among dunes that glimmered faintly under a pale, unshaken sky, heavy with waiting heat. The air tasted of salt, carried from unseen distances, its dryness clinging to tongues and lips, as though the desert wished to keep the voices of those who crossed it, weaving them silently into its endless, wind-carved hollows of sand and stone. Light here poured without shade or mercy, yet it softened in the late hours when the sun leaned westward, turning dunes into slow rivers of copper and gold sliding endlessly beneath a horizon where nothing moved except wind like invisible water. The wanderers walked with cloth drawn over faces, the air so still between gusts that each step left its echoing imprint too sharply upon the sand, prints remaining longer than memory before wind finally erased them with patient, unhurried hands. They carried water carefully wrapped in skins, each drop tasting of distant hills already forgotten behind them. The desert air so dry it carried no scent at all, except the faint mineral sharpness rising when wind slid across heated stone. Toward evening they reached a cluster of rocks blackened by sun, until the air above them shimmered like stirred glass, and there they rested where lizards darted among cracks, carrying the day's heat into night's approaching coolness beneath a swelling moon. The sky cleared entirely once the sun fell, leaving stars thrown in rivers of light across blackness so deep it felt almost wet, the constellations burning sharp enough to cast faint silver glints along dunes curling outward like frozen waves. Here the wind began its low singing among rocks shaped into hollows by centuries of dust passing, its voice deep and hollow, yet carrying a rhythm like slow breathing, as though the earth itself spoke only after darkness returned. The wanderers listened beside their fire while sparks lifted upward, trembling before vanishing into the night. The wind's tone never breaking into words, yet circling them with something older than language, a murmuring deeper than meaning itself. Sand moved softly across their sleeping mats by midnight, the wind weaving pale threads along the ground so slowly it felt more like drifting snow than dust, carrying coolness through the hollow where they rested beneath leaning rock walls. One of them dreamt of water running beneath dunes in secret darkness, a river flowing under miles of sand without ever reaching sunlight, its current carrying stars downward into unseen caverns beneath the desert's patient, listening silence. Before dawn they climbed a ridge where wind had carved shapes like frozen sails from the sandstone, the rock warm even in darkness, as though holding sunlight inside itself, releasing it slowly through the hours when stars still burned above. From that height they saw the desert stretching without boundary, the dunes paling at their edges beneath the earliest light, shadows retreating toward hollows where wind had already begun to gather before day spread its long, shimmering heat again. The wanderers moved carefully downward as morning widened, their footprints once again marking paths the wind would later erase, the air filling with brightness until even the sky seemed bleached of color, its blue washed almost to white above them. By midday they reached a dry riverbed lined with stones worn smooth by floods that came only once in many years. The ground cracked and pale beneath driftwood scattered like bones, left after waters vanished into a thirstier season. Here they rested in the thin line of shade cast by leaning cliffs, the air holding the faintest coolness where wind funneled softly between walls, carrying with it the powdery scent of dust and the faint metallic temps of stone. The oldest watched a hawk circle far above, its shadow gliding briefly over the cliffs before vanishing again, its wings tilting without sound as it searched for movement along the emptiness spreading outward beyond the riverbed's pale skeleton. When evening came, they followed the dry channel westward, where wind shaped low drifts along its edges, the path winding gently between cliffs whose surfaces burned orange then deepened to violet as the sun leaned toward another long descent. They camped upon a flat ledge above the channel where stones still held the day's warmth, firelight flickering softly against the cliff, while night crept over dunes in slow layers, stars appearing once more in clear, crystalline brightness overhead. The wind returned after midnight, carrying sand in slow, soft waves across the ground, its voice echoing faintly through hollows beyond their fire, where darkness shaped dunes into shifting ridges, moving so slowly they seemed almost carved by dream. The youngest lay awake, listening to that sound, the wind neither rising nor falling, but circling endlessly through the desert's unseen distances, its voice steady enough to feel like breathing, as though the night itself slept lightly across the sands. By morning the wind had stilled again, leaving only drifts half buried around their camp, the sun climbing swiftly into a sky unbroken by cloud, its light turning every grain of sand into brightness, too sharp for open eyes to follow. They rose slowly, shoulders powdered with dust where they had slept beside the fire's faint ashes, and began walking westward again, the desert carrying away each trace of them as though no one had crossed it for 1,000 years. By afternoon they reached land where scattered acacias grew low against the wind, their branches twisted yet green enough to carry faint scents of resin and flowers, so small they seemed made entirely of sunlight pressed into living shapes. Beyond those trees, the desert thinned toward hills where stone glimmered pale against sky, again turning gold at its edges. The wanderers moving quietly across ground that softened gradually beneath their steps until grasses began returning among the rocks. They stopped at dusk beside a spring bubbling faintly from beneath roots of a lone fig tree, the water cold enough to startle lips dry from wind, its taste carrying sweetness rare after so many days of sand and sun. The fire that night burned fragrant with wood gathered from acacias left behind, its smoke rising straight into still air while stars drifted slowly westward above the hills, the desert behind them lying silent again beneath the sleeping wind. Past the hills, where grasses whispered against the wind in thin, rustling voices, the wanderers came upon a valley where the air sharpened with a brightness that clung to the eyes like white fire reflecting off waterless earth. The ground here glittered under the sun as though snow had fallen and refused to melt, yet the air carried no coolness, only the dry taste of minerals, lifting faintly into the wind from surfaces burned pale and silent beneath the sky. At its heart lay walls once built from blocks carved directly from this salted earth, their edges softened now by centuries of wind-carrying dust, yet still rising in patterns that hinted at streets and courtyards beneath the bleaching sun. The city stretched outward like a fossilized memory, towers broken to waist height, doorways leading nowhere. Roofs collapsed long ago, until only shadows held themselves thinly against the blinding brightness filling each open place between walls. The wanderers walked slowly through avenues that wound toward a square, where winds circled among columns, leaning like tired sentinels. The air here utterly dry, holding nothing alive except faint tremors of heat rippling above the pale stone. No birds flew overhead, no insects whispered among the cracks. The city carrying only the brittle hush of a place left behind before language learned how to name abandonment. Before kingdoms carved borders along maps now long forgotten. One touched a wall where salt gathered in ridges along the stone's face. Its surface rough, yet crumbling softly like pressed powder under his palm, leaving a faint glitter clinging to skin, as though the city marked those passing through. Beneath a fallen arch, they found fragments of pottery, sharp enough still to catch light. Their colors faded into the same whiteness, covering everything here, each piece holding silence, like vessels once filled then emptied, before time blew through. The wind moved lazily across the open square, carrying no scent except faint bitterness rising from the salted ground. The air so clear it seemed to ring faintly when gusts slipped through broken corridors, open to the pale sky above. They rested in the shadow of a leaning wall where the ground cooled slightly, the surface beneath them rough with grains crumbling softly whenever they shifted. Each sound strangely loud against the silence pressing from every side. By evening the sun slid lower until the walls burned copper along their edges, shadows thickening beneath doorways leading into rooms, long roofless where the sky entered freely, carrying the first faint stars across ceilings now erased by wind. The wanderers lit no fire here, the air too dry for wood. So darkness spread gently through the streets until the walls glimmered faintly under moonlight, as though the city itself glowed softly from salt, drinking the night's cold silver. They lay among fallen columns, where wind sighed faintly through cracks between stones, its voice low enough to blend with the stillness, until the city seemed to breathe, very slowly, as though remembering lives long vanished into the white earth. One dreamed of water rising suddenly through the streets, a flood turning walls bright, and mirrors forming across floors where salt dissolved slowly into clear pools reflecting stars. The city remade briefly before drying once more into emptiness. At dawn they climbed a stairway leading to nothing but air, its steps worn into shallow hollows by feet long gone, each stone cool beneath their hands where dough gathered faintly before the sun began burning it away again. From that height the city spread outward like chalk lines drawn upon a giant slate, the walls throwing long shadows westward, while the hills beyond shifted in early light from violet into brown as the sun cleared the horizon. The wanderers followed a street sloping downward toward gates, half buried in drifts, where the walls ended abruptly, the open desert beyond already trembling beneath the day's coming heat, as wind moved thin veils of dust along the horizon. Near the gates they found a well cut deep into stone, its mouth ringed by a crumbling wall of bricks, white with salt, where wind had piled dust in corners. The air above it dry enough to carry no echo. When a pebble dropped from their hands fell silently into darkness below. They listened, yet heard nothing rise again. No splash, no hollow sound of depth, only air standing still where once water might have waited under the city. By midday they left through those gates, stepping into light that thickened quickly until the air shook faintly above the ground. The city receding behind them under sky empty of clouds, its walls paling until distance erased their lines entirely. Heat settled heavily across the desert floor, so that even the wind moved slowly, as though reluctant to disturb the silence following them outward. The air holding faint bitterness that clung to their tongues whenever dust lifted briefly from the earth. Toward evening they reached a ridge of stone where they looked back once more. The city behind them now only a white shimmer pressed flat against the horizon, as though it had sunk slowly back into the salted earth itself. The sun leaned red toward the western hills, its light pouring across the desert until the ground burned briefly before cooling into shadow. The air finally softening as wind returned, carrying faint scents of dust and distance once again. They camped that night where the ridge dropped toward plains scattered with dry grass, whispering faintly whenever wind moved through. The ground here warmer than stone, holding echoes of life absent from the city lying silent behind them. The moon rose slowly, washing the desert in pale brightness, until even the grass shone faintly silver along its edges. Their campfire small beside that light, as though reluctant to disturb so much stillness, spread beneath the wide night. Sleep came slowly after the silence carried from the city seemed to settle around them. Each wanderer turning inward beneath blankets, smelling faintly of smoke and dust. Dreams drifting like wind through corridors, empty beneath their own remembered stars. When morning widened again across the plains, the city was gone from sight entirely, as though they had crossed not stone and salt, but only memory itself. Leaving behind walls that once held voices now dissolved into wind and white earth. They walked westward beneath a sky paling toward day, where grasses bent faintly before the wind's slow breath, their footprints trailing behind across soil already holding seeds, waiting for seasons that would one day green the land again. By afternoon, a river's glimmer showed faintly ahead where water spread thin among reeds, lifting their narrow blades above the current. The air softening with scents of mud and leaves after so many days, carrying only dust upon it. They followed its banks toward hills shadowed faintly beneath clouds, gathering for the first time in many weeks. The sky cooling as wind moved carefully between reeds where birds rose in slow arcs, scattering water in circles widening outward. That night they camped where the river bent toward cliffs rising black against the stars, its current speaking softly against stones beneath darkness where moonlight slid in broken lines across the restless silver-skinned water flowing steadily westward. Beyond the river's curve, where reeds whispered together in the evening wind. The wanderers followed a path, climbing slowly toward ridges, where air thinned and clouds moved like silent caravans drifting above hills, scorched pale beneath the sun's long memory. The earth underfoot grew harder as they climbed, soil giving way to stone cracked by heat, yet softened at its edges by centuries of wind, brushing endlessly across surfaces once cooled by water, no longer flowing here. Through the narrow pass, they entered a valley shaped like a shallow bowl, where wind paused as though unsure whether to leave or stay. The air holding stillness, heavy with the faint sweetness of dust after many dry years. The ground bore lines carved faintly by streams long vanished, channels where wind had gathered leaves bleached to colorless fragments that crumbled softly when touched, releasing the scent of age into air tasting faintly of distant storms. They walked among scattered trees, standing leafless yet rooted deeply, their bark silvered by sun and time, until each trunk shone faintly in the light slanting through late afternoon like thin flames burning upward without heat or sound. In the valley's center lay a hollow where soil darkened strangely as though remembering water, the ground cracked yet holding faint traces of green whenever wind shifted dust thinly across roots waiting beneath, like sleepers not yet stirred. The wanderers built no fire that evening, for air moved coolly through the valley's curves, carrying scents of stone and shadows gathering along the slopes, where night descended softly without birdsong or insect voices rising from the earth below. They ate in silence while stars began sharpening above the hills, their light spilling cold and bright into the valley until each silver beam seemed to rest faintly upon stones, trees, and the wanderers themselves with equal stillness. One traced channels in the earth, with his hand feeling edges worn smooth by floods no one living had seen, his fingers moving through dust, carrying no moisture, yet remembering water in the way its curves held the ground. Wind returned after midnight, carrying scents different from dust alone, a coolness rising across the valley floor as clouds thickened slowly above ridges, where lightning moved faintly without sound along distant edges of the sky. They lay awake, hearing nothing except wind curling low among dry grasses. The night suddenly restless, though rain had not yet begun, air swelling with the quiet expectancy of a world holding its breath for something long delayed. Toward morning, a single drop struck the hollow earth with a sound so small it vanished instantly. Yet the wanderers lifted their heads as though that faint touch carried weight enough to bend time back upon itself. Then more drops followed, slow and heavy, each one spreading dark circles across the pale ground until the air smelled of stone cooling after centuries beneath sun, and the valley began shivering faintly under gathering water. The rain thickened into threads falling straight through windless air, their sound growing until the earth itself seemed to breathe as dust melted slowly into dark soil, drinking greedily after waiting longer than any voice could remember. The wanderers stood motionless while water slid over their shoulders, its coldness startling after so many dry weeks, their clothing clinging as though the valley itself wrapped them in its sudden, trembling renewal. Streams awoke in long-forgotten channels, their paths shining silver through the hollow's darkness where frogs began calling, though none had been heard or seen when the night carried only dust and wind across the silent earth. By dawn, pools gathered beneath the trees where roots reached upward like hands remembering the sky, their reflections trembling whenever drops fell through branches, now stirring faintly with leaves unfolding after lifetimes held tightly closed. The air carried scents of moss and bark swelling after dryness, fragrances so deep and sudden the wanderers breathed slowly as though fearing to disturb something ancient, returning carefully to a world too brittle for haste. The rain slowed by mid-morning, leaving the valley washed pale gold beneath sunlight, breaking through torn clouds where steam lifted faintly from soil dark with new water sinking downward into roots waiting below. Birds appeared from nowhere to scatter across the hills, their calls thin yet carrying far as though the sky itself had opened voices. Long silent before the first drops fell upon the cracked earth hours earlier, the wanderers drank from a pool forming where three channels met, the water cold and tasting of stone, yet soft upon the tongue after weeks of rivers running shallow between banks dry enough to crumble under wind. They rested beside that pool while air warmed slowly. Insects humming low among grasses lifting slender stalks above soil turning green along its edges as seeds hidden for decades split carefully toward sunlight. By evening the valley glimmered beneath a thin mist rising where warmth touched wet earth, the slopes glowing faintly as though rain itself left light scattered among branches, stones, and pools, reflecting the day's last brightness. The wanderers built a small fire at the valley's rim where wood gathered from distant slopes, burned with sharp sweetness rising from bark soaked by rain, then dried quickly beneath the returning sun. They watched stars emerge above hills washed dark blue after stormlight faded. Constellations hard and clear across air rinsed of dust where the valley now breathed slowly beneath them, like some living thing restored by water's brief return. One dreamed of rivers flowing again through those channels, fish flashing beneath leaves, crowding branches heavy with rain. The valley filled with voices of creatures moving through pools, widening under seasons, learning once more how to carry water. When morning came, the earth still smelled of rain, though no drops fell. The sky pale and open above slopes, holding glimmers of green, where grass pushed through soil, soft for the first time in a century. The wanderers left, following streams, trickling toward canyons westward, the valley behind them folding into silence, again though its trees kept faint rustlings as wind moved among new leaves opening toward the returning sun. By afternoon, the land sloped downward toward plains, where clouds drifted low above cliffs, cut sharply against the horizon, their faces washed clean by storms moving eastward, leaving air cool and smelling faintly of wet stone. That night they camped where one stream met another, beneath cottonwoods rising black against the stars. The water's voice quiet yet steady where it slipped among roots, holding soil loose after rain softened the valley's hardened heart. As sleep gathered slowly, the wanderers lay listening to water flowing through darkness, carrying pieces of earth loosened after centuries. The stream's song soft, yet filled with beginnings, too new for words, older than rain itself. The wanderers moved westward as summer leaned toward its quiet ending, the sun drifting lower each evening until its warmth carried softness rather than heat across the grasses, rolling endlessly toward a horizon pale with late-season haze. The land spread outward so widely that wind had nothing to break against, its slow breath sliding through the grasses in long ripples like water remembering an ocean no one alive had ever seen or named. They followed the river until it thinned into channels glinting faintly beneath the evening light, water slipping away beneath reeds while dragonflies skimmed above pools, shrinking under days growing shorter, though the air still held the taste of warmth. The plain itself carried a hush beneath the wind's steady murmur, as though distances here grew too vast for sound to travel far before thinning into silence, where only grasses spoke softly among themselves beneath the sky. Scents shifted with every hour as they walked, morning carrying cool sweetness from riverbanks, afternoon holding the dry smell of sunlit earth, and night filling the air with faint fragrance rising where roots breathed beneath darkening soil. Stars grew sharper with each evening as the days slowly cooled, their light falling across the plain in silver stillness until it lay over grasses, stones, and the wanderers themselves, like a language the earth could no longer speak. The wanderers gathered firewood where low trees clung to ravines, cutting through the plain's vast floor, each branch dry beneath its rough bark, yet carrying the sweetness of sap hardened slowly under many seasons of wind and sun. They built small fires at night, whose smoke rose thin and vertical through air so calm that sparks drifted upward like faint messengers, carrying voices too small for the stars to hear across such distances. One of them carved symbols into the earth with a stick pulled from the fire's edge, his hand moving slowly as though tracing words no one remembered how to read beneath starlight sharpening above the silent plain. Another listened to the wind moving through grasses, their voices bending low around the fire's circle, as though the earth itself shaped songs, carrying memory through roots older than any traveler still walking its surface. The youngest among them lifted her face toward the sky's wide darkness, where constellations leaned heavily above the horizon, her eyes reflecting pale starlight, while her breath rose faintly like smoke, fading into air too deep for answers. They slept with no walls around them, while frost gathered faintly along grass blades shining when moonlight struck, its touch crisp against blankets roughened by dust, yet warmed slowly where embers still glowed beneath thin curls of smoke. Morning brought light breaking gently across a world turned silver, where dew clung to every stem and stone, the sun climbing slowly until it poured warmth through grasses, trembling as though the earth itself stirred under its return. They walked beneath hawks, circling far above the plain's empty miles, their shadows sliding over grass without sound while insects lifted in sudden swarms. Whenever footsteps brushed seeds, scattering softly into air, warmed after night's long stillness. Water grew scarce as days stretched westward, pools sinking lower until mud cracked around, edges dark beneath thin reflections, carrying the sky's pale light broken whenever wind laid ripples across their surfaces, waiting for rain not yet gathered. At dusk they found a rise, where stone broke through grasses like bones of some ancient creature long since swallowed by earth, its surfaces worn pale by wind carrying centuries slowly across this open, listening land. Here they camped, while stars poured through the night's wide silence until even the horizon vanished, the plain itself dissolving into darkness, holding only firelight, windsong, and voices drifting low among travelers gathered close against cooling air. One told of rivers crossing lands no longer found, waters so wide they swallowed light before carrying it downward into depths, where fish moved like pieces of sky fallen into currents older than wind itself. Another spoke softly of mountains, where snow never left, even in summers so bright the sun turned ice into rivers, leaping through valleys green as the first springs the earth ever allowed to open beneath clouds. The youngest said nothing while watching the fire sink slowly into coals, glowing beneath wind drawing sparks toward stars above so silent it seemed they leaned closer to hear words rising too softly through night's breathing. Sleep came slowly, while frost silvered grasses beneath constellations unchanging above distances, holding no villages, no smoke, no walls, only wind shaping earth into curves, carrying seeds further each season across the plain's open heart. By morning, a thin mist blurred the horizon so the world seemed endless, sky folding downward until grasses vanished softly where air met earth, with no line to tell one from the other beneath pale sunlight. The wanderers moved westward as wind carried scents of water returning somewhere beyond sight. Air cool upon their faces, though no clouds yet gathered above miles, drifting outward until even the birds turned back toward rivers. Each evening the fires grew smaller as wood grew scarce, smoke lifting faintly while travelers spoke less often, as though words themselves thinned like streams, sliding quietly into soil, to dry to hold their shapes for long. On the 10th night they camped beside stones blackened by ancient fires built before memory reached this far. Ashes long scattered, yet shadows of flames clinging faintly where wind carved hollows into rock hardened by centuries. No one spoke for a long while after darkness fell, because stars hung so close above the plain it seemed their cold light touched skin directly. Each traveler, feeling its weight settle softly through air without sound. Then the youngest whispered a single phrase no one understood, yet all heard as wind carried it outward. The sound folding into grasses, bending slowly, as though the plain itself had been waiting for that voice. The others said nothing, while firelight trembled across their faces, because the words seemed not meant for them but for stars, leaning heavily above miles empty enough to hold echoes long after voices fell silent. When morning returned, the travelers rose without speaking, leaving ashes pale against stone, while wind erased footprints slowly until even the plain forgot where fires had burned beneath constellations, watching without closing their bright, listening eyes. By afternoon, the wanderers reached the horizon's faint curve, where Earth bent toward distances, holding only light, wind, and the slow turning of stars, waiting for voices that never returned across the plain's wide and listening silence.